When it comes to Father's Day, some things never change. Dads want steak. And the experts at Omaha Steaks are making it easy for you to deliver uncompromising quality with gifts that are sure to make his day. Plus, get an extra $35 off with code THANKSDAD when you shop omahasteaks.com today. We know, being your dad means he already has everything he could want. But just picture the look on his face when he sees those extra-aged USDA-certified tender steaks, juicy air-chilled chicken, beefy burgers, and more. With carefully curated gift packages from America's original butcher, it's never been easier to show everyone why you're dad's favorite. And every bite is 100% guaranteed to bring a thrill to the king of the grill. Shop now at omahasteaks.com and get an extra $35 off with code THANKSDAD. But don't wait. Father's Day is June 15th. Minimum purchase may apply. See site for details.
Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through the cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but have left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth? Well, that's another story. Now imagine this. It is a chilly January morning in a small Oregon town. The streets are quiet, life feels peaceful, and no one expects the events that are about to unfold. But then, in a shocking turn, a routine traffic stop reveals the aftermath of a gruesome crime, one that shakes the community to its core. The perpetrator? A man recently released from a state psychiatric hospital, claiming he was never insane to begin with. The question everyone is asking is, how did this happen? And here we're going to dive into the controversial case of Anthony Montwheeler, a man whose long history with the insanity defense raises some chilling questions. Did the system fail to recognize a cunning manipulator? Or did it release someone truly unfit to face the real world? And what does justice look like in a case where the lines between mental illness and deception blur? This case doesn't just challenge the insanity defense. It forces us to confront the limitations of our legal and mental health systems. Is the insanity plea a safeguard for those who need it? Or is it a loophole that can be exploited? By the end of this episode, you will have the chance to decide for yourself. Did Anthony Montwheeler manipulate the system, or was this a tragic failure of justice? And consider this. Is deceiving justice to get the insanity plea worth it as a way out? What happens when someone plays the system and the consequences spiral beyond control? Anthony Montwheeler's case is one that leaves everyone questioning not just the individual, but the system. Back in 1996, Montwheeler was charged with kidnapping his ex-wife and son. Facing serious charges, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, a defense that ultimately saved him from prison. Now, instead, he was sent to the Oregon State Hospital, where he remained for nearly 20 years. So he kidnaps his then wife and their son at gunpoint in Baker City, Oregon, and this is what he gets: 20 years in the Oregon State Hospital. But here's where things get complicated. After he spent those nearly 2 decades in a psychiatric facility, Montwheeler petitioned for his release. This is in 2016, and he claims he'd been faking his mental illness the whole time. And he argued that his initial insanity plea had been a deliberate attempt to avoid prison, and that he no longer posed a threat to society. He was all done with that. And shockingly, his claim was successful. He was deemed no longer mentally ill, and the guy gets released without any supervision. And this is a decision that would soon have devastating consequences, because just weeks after his release, Montwheeler's name made headlines again for another shocking act of violence. This time, he kidnapped and murdered a different ex-wife, another one, in a horrific escalation of events. During a chaotic police chase following the crime, Montwheeler caused a crash that claimed the life of an innocent bystander as well. These events sent shockwaves through the community and reignited a heated debate about the insanity defense and whether the system had failed to prevent this tragedy. How did a man with such a troubling history manage to convince experts he was no longer a threat? Did the system fail to catch a cunning manipulator? When did it become about the patient to decide their care? Or was this simply something where people were unprepared, the system was unprepared to handle someone like Anthony Montwheeler? And more importantly, what happens when the boundaries between deception and mental illness and justice blur so completely? Well, by the end of this episode, we'll explore every side of this case, the legal system's responsibility, and the mental health implications, and the devastating impact on the victims and their families. Was Montwheeler's release a tragic oversight, or a calculated gamble by someone who knew exactly how to work the system? And ultimately, how do we as a society balance compassion with accountability when it comes to mental illness and the justice system? And lastly, how was it for Montwheeler? What would life be like pulling this sort of stunt, and life on the inside? And was it truly the lesser punishment here, or just another part of this story? Anthony Montwheeler's story begins in 1996 with a violent and terrifying act. At that time, Montwheeler was married and had a young son. According to reports, he kidnapped his then-wife and their child at gunpoint, threatening their lives in a desperate and unstable moment. And this act of domestic terror led to his arrest. But instead of serving time in prison, he invoked the insanity defense. Montwheeler was found guilty, except for insanity, a legal distinction in Oregon that allowed him to avoid a traditional sentence and instead be committed to the Oregon State Hospital. For nearly 2 decades, Montwheeler lived in the hospital system, undergoing treatment and evaluations. And while this may sound like an alternative form of justice, the reality is far more complex. Psychiatric facilities like the Oregon State Hospital are not places of freedom or leniency. They are secure environments. They have strict rules, limited autonomy, and intensive therapeutic programs. Still, for someone with the right skills and motives, the system can be manipulated, and that's exactly what Montwheeler claimed to have done. In 2016, after years of confinement, Montwheeler petitioned for his release, arguing he had been faking his mental illness the entire time. This shocking confession caused an uproar, but he managed to convince a panel of experts that he was no longer mentally ill. And based on his assertion and the evaluations provided, he was deemed safe for release. This decision came with no conditions, no oversight, no requirement for ongoing monitoring, a move that many would later criticize as a fatal error. Montwheeler's release might have marked the end of his time in the system, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter of violence. Within weeks, he was once again at the center of a tragic and horrific crime. The 2017 incident involved the brutal stabbing of his ex-wife, Anita Harmon, and a deadly car crash that claimed another innocent life. These events forced everyone to ask, did the system fail here? Or did Montwheeler outsmart it? How do we weigh the consequences of releasing someone who claims to have deceived justice from the start? The decision to release Anthony Montwheeler without supervision is one that still sparks heated debate. How could a man who openly admitted to deceiving the system for nearly 20 years walk away a free man without any safeguards? It's pretty amazing. And for many, it seemed like a glaring failure in both the legal and mental health systems. Others wondered if Montwheeler's admission was simply a calculated move, a confession designed to achieve the one thing he wanted most: freedom. To understand the decision, it's important to look at the criteria used to evaluate patients for release. Montwheeler underwent a series of psychiatric evaluations, and at that time, experts determined he no longer exhibited signs of mental illness. This assessment, coupled with his claim that he had been feigning his condition, led to his discharge. But here is the catch. The system relied on his honesty. And honesty, as we've seen, was not one of Montwheeler's strong suits, and he flat out said so. Within weeks of his release, his actions sent shockwaves through the community. The brutal murder of Anita Harmon, followed by that deadly car crash. It left 2 families devastated and an entire town grappling with questions. Should someone who committed such heinous acts ever have been released? Or was his ability to manipulate the system proof that he was never truly mad in the first place? The case also raised broader questions about the insanity defense itself. Critics argued that the very system designed to rehabilitate and protect had been weaponized against society. Advocates, however, maintained that Montwheeler's crimes were an outlier, not a failure of the system as a whole. After all, the insanity defense is used in only a fraction of cases, and successful pleas are even rarer. Was Montwheeler simply an anomaly, a rare case where deception triumphed over due diligence? What we do know is this: the consequences of his release were catastrophic. 2 lives were lost, and countless others were forever changed. And as the dust settled, one question loomed large. How do we strike a balance between protecting individual rights and safeguarding public safety? Anthony Montwheeler's case didn't just shake the community where the tragedy unfolded. This thing became a flashpoint for national discussions about the insanity defense and the systems meant to uphold justice. At the heart of the controversy lies a critical dilemma. How do we ensure that those who genuinely need good mental health treatment actually receive it, while also preventing individuals from exploiting the system to try to escape accountability? For decades, the insanity defense has been a contentious subject. On one hand, it provides a necessary safeguard for individuals who lack the mental capacity to understand their actions. On the other hand, it's a defense that is often met with public skepticism, viewed by many as a loophole for avoiding prison. Montwheeler's case only fueled these fears. His admission that he faked his mental illness for years called into question the effectiveness of all those evaluations and the oversight process, all of that meant to detect deception. The fallout from Montwheeler's release revealed significant gaps in the system. Critics pointed to the lack of post-release monitoring as a glaring failure. Why wasn't there a probationary period or a mandatory follow-up care in place? And why wasn't his violent past considered a red flag, even after his supposed recovery? These oversights cost lives, leaving families and communities to pick up the pieces. But Montwheeler's case also highlighted the human side of the insanity defense. For those who are genuinely mentally ill, psychiatric facilities can be places of both treatment and confinement. They are not prisons, but they're not havens of freedom either. For someone like Montwheeler, who later claimed to have been feigning his illness, life inside such a facility may have felt unbearable, spurring his desperate bid for release. Ultimately, his story raises questions far beyond one man's actions. How do we balance compassion with accountability? It's a never-ending question. Is the insanity defense still an effective tool, or does it need to be reformed to prevent cases like this from happening again? And perhaps most disturbingly, how do we ensure that justice serves not just the individual, but society as a whole? Anthony Montwheeler's journey through the legal and mental health systems began in 1996 with that act of violence that stunned his family and the community. At the time, Montwheeler kidnapped his then-wife and their young son at gunpoint in Baker City, Oregon. He held them hostage in a terrifying ordeal that ultimately ends in his arrest. Facing serious charges, Montwheeler invokes the insanity defense, claiming he was suffering from severe mental illness and unable to understand the consequences of what he had done. The court accepts the plea, and he's found guilty, except for insanity. This is a designation specific to Oregon law. Now, instead of going to prison, he gets committed to the Oregon State Hospital. This is a secure psychiatric facility. Here, he was to receive treatment until deemed no longer a danger to himself or others. For nearly 20 years, Montwheeler remained in the hospital, undergoing evaluations and treatment for what doctors initially believed to be a genuine mental illness. Throughout his time in the hospital, Montwheeler participated in routine assessments to determine his progress. However, in 2016, everything changed. He petitioned for his release, claiming he'd been faking his mental illness from the very beginning. He argued that he had manipulated the system to avoid prison and that he no longer met the criteria for psychiatric confinement. Psychiatrists evaluated Montwheeler and found no evidence of ongoing mental illness. This assessment, coupled with his admission, led the Oregon Psychiatric Security Review Board to authorize his release in December of 16. The decision sparked controversy, with some questioning how someone with such a violent history could be deemed safe for reintegration into society. Montwheeler's release came with no conditions, no monitoring, no required follow-up care, a move that many saw as a ticking time bomb. And just weeks later, it was January of 17, when Montwheeler's actions confirmed those worst fears. His name returned to the headlines after a brutal crime that left 2 people dead, shattered countless lives. The events that followed his release raised serious concerns about the effectiveness of the systems that are meant to protect both the public and those within their care. On December 7th of 2016, Anthony Montwheeler was officially discharged from the Oregon State Hospital. The decision came after he successfully convinced the evaluators that he no longer suffered from mental illness. That's amazing. Or, as he claimed, he never even had one to begin with. For nearly 2 decades, Montwheeler had lived under strict supervision in a secure psychiatric facility with limited freedoms and constant monitoring. Now he was leaving the system entirely, free to return to society without any restrictions. For many, the idea that someone with Montwheeler's violent past could walk away from the system without oversight, it was just unthinkable. The decision came under immediate scrutiny, with critics arguing that it prioritized Montwheeler's rights over public safety. But at the time, the law was clear. If Montwheeler no longer met the criteria for psychiatric confinement, he could not legally be held. This also makes sense. His admission of having faked his mental illness only added fuel to the fire, raising concerns about whether he had successfully manipulated the very system designed to ensure justice and rehabilitation. Just 1 month after his release, Montwheeler's freedom turned into a nightmare for those around him. On January 9th, 2017, Montwheeler lured his ex-wife Anita Harmon into his pickup truck under the guise of discussing a financial matter. And what followed was a horrific escalation. According to reports, Montwheeler drove to a gas station in Ontario, Oregon, where he stabbed Anita multiple times in broad daylight, killing her in a brutal and calculated attack. As police closed in on him, Montwheeler fled the scene in his truck, leading officers on a high-speed chase. His reckless flight ended in tragedy when he collided head-on with another vehicle, killing 38-year-old David Bates and severely injuring his wife, Jessica. The devastation of that single day was immeasurable, leaving 2 families torn apart and a community in shock. Montwheeler was immediately arrested and faced charges of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and assault. The events sparked outrage, with many questioning how the system had allowed such a tragedy to occur. Had Montwheeler truly outsmarted everyone, or had the system failed to recognize the danger he still posed? The events of January 9th, 2017 left the small Oregon community reeling. In the days following the brutal murder of Anita and the death of David, questions about Anthony Montwheeler's release took center stage. How could a man with such a violent history, who openly admitted to faking his own mental illness, have been freed without any form of monitoring or follow-up care? Montwheeler's arrest brought new scrutiny to the Oregon Psychiatric Security Review Board, the body responsible for overseeing cases like his. Critics accused the board of prioritizing legal technicalities over public safety. The lack of safeguards in Montwheeler's release sparked outrage, with many arguing that his violent history should have been a clear red flag that should have been dealt with. Meanwhile, the families of Anita and David were left to grapple with the unimaginable grief of being left behind something like this, their lives forever altered by a system they felt had failed to protect them. As Montwheeler awaited trial, details of his life and behavior in the Oregon State Hospital began to emerge. Former staff members described him as manipulative and unpredictable, someone who had learned how to navigate the system to his advantage. His admission that he had faked his mental illness only deepened the public's anger, as many saw it as proof that he had played the system from the start. Legally, Montwheeler faced a daunting list of charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and assault. If convicted, he would likely face life in prison or even the death penalty, but the case was far from straightforward. Defense attorneys began to argue that despite his claims of deception, Montwheeler still suffered from genuine mental health issues that had gone untreated after his release. This argument added another layer to a case that already defied any easy answers. The public response was swift, and it was unforgiving. For many, Montwheeler represented the worst-case scenario, a man who had not only exploited the insanity defense, but also caused irreparable harm after his release. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the case became a rallying cry for reforms to the insanity defense and the systems designed to evaluate and monitor individuals who are released after long-term psychiatric care. Anthony Montwheeler's case quickly became a symbol of systemic failure, raising questions about how the insanity defense is applied and the protocols for releasing individuals from psychiatric care. While Montwheeler sat in jail awaiting trial, lawmakers, mental health professionals, and the public engaged in heated debates about what had gone wrong and how such tragedies could be prevented in the future. One of the most glaring issues highlighted by this case was the lack of mandatory post-release monitoring. Unlike parole or probation, which typically include strict supervision and regular check-ins, Montwheeler's release came with no strings attached. The Oregon Psychiatric Security Review Board had followed the letter of the law, which dictated that Montwheeler could not be held if he no longer met the criteria for confinement. But critics argued that the law itself was flawed, prioritizing the rights of individuals over the safety of the community. In response to public outrage, Oregon lawmakers began to examine whether changes to the state's mental health laws were actually necessary. There were proposals that included implementing mandatory follow-up care for individuals released from psychiatric facilities and creating a more rigorous process for evaluating claims of recovered mental health. Some advocates called for a complete overhaul of the insanity defense, arguing that cases like Montwheeler's eroded public trust in the system. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Montwheeler moved forward, though not without complications. His defense team maintained that his long history of psychiatric treatment should be considered a mitigating factor. They argued that while he had admitted to faking his initial insanity plea, his time in the Oregon State Hospital may have worsened underlying mental health issues that went untreated after his release. This argument left many wondering, was Montwheeler entirely to blame? or did the system play a role in his tragic spiral? For the families of Anita and David, these debates offered little solace. Their focus remained on seeking justice for their loved ones and ensuring that no other families would have to endure such loss. As the case gained national attention, it became clear that Montwheeler's story was about more than one man's actions. This was a reckoning for the systems that had failed to stop him. When Anthony Montwheeler's case went to trial, the courtroom became a battleground for two competing narratives. One that painted him as a cold-blooded manipulator who had exploited the insanity defense, and another that portrayed him as a deeply troubled individual who had slipped through the cracks of a broken system. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They argued that Montwheeler had intentionally and meticulously manipulated the legal system from the very beginning. By pleading insanity back in '96, he had avoided a lengthy prison sentence for his initial crimes. Then, after nearly 2 decades of psychiatric confinement, he exploited the system once again, this time to secure his release. The fact that Montwheeler openly admitted to faking his mental illness was a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument. They contended that his deception was proof of premeditation and malice, qualities that pointed to a calculated killer rather than someone suffering from a mental health crisis. To bolster their case, the prosecution highlighted the brutal nature of the crimes Montwheeler committed in January of 17. The murder of Anita Harmon was carried out in broad daylight. There were no signs of hesitation, no remorse. The high-speed police chase that followed, which resulted in the death of David Bates, further demonstrated a reckless disregard for human life. For the prosecution, these facts painted a clear picture. Montwheeler was not insane. He was dangerous and manipulative, and he needed to be held accountable. The defense, however, presented a much more complex picture. While they didn't dispute Montwheeler's admission of deception, they argued that his long history of psychiatric treatment couldn't be ignored. According to the defense, Montwheeler's time in the Oregon State Hospital may have exacerbated existing mental health issues, leaving him untreated and unstable upon his release. They also pointed out the lack of any structured reintegration plan, which left Montwheeler to navigate freedom entirely on his own after 20 years of confinement. These arguments set the stage for a courtroom drama that would not only determine Montwheeler's fate, but also force everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about that intersection between mental health and justice. As the trial continued, the prosecution focused on dismantling any notion that Anthony Montwheeler's actions could be attributed to untreated mental illness. Instead, they framed him as a cunning manipulator who had exploited the system at every turn. Prosecutors presented evidence of his calm and calculated demeanor leading up to the murder of Anita, pointing out that Montwheeler had planned the meeting with her, all under false pretenses. This premeditation, they argued, was not the behavior of someone in the throes of a mental breakdown, but rather a deliberate act of violence. They also drew attention to the high-speed chase that followed Anita's murder. Witnesses testified that Montwheeler drove recklessly, weaving through traffic and showing no concern for the safety of others. The crash that killed David Bates and injured his wife, Jessica, was described as a direct result of his disregard for human life. Prosecutors insisted that these actions demonstrated Montwheeler's dangerousness and his ability to act with full awareness of his choices, qualities that undermined any claim of diminished responsibility. Meanwhile, the defense worked to shift the narrative, urging the court to consider the broader context of Montwheeler's life and the systemic failures that may have contributed to the tragedy. They argued that while Montwheeler's confession of faking his insanity plea cast him in a negative light, it did not negate the possibility that he struggled with genuine mental health issues. According to the defense, the nearly 20 years he spent in the Oregon State Hospital could have worsened underlying conditions, leaving him untreated and vulnerable when he was released. They criticized the lack of a post-release plan for Montwheeler, and highlighted that after spending 2 decades in a highly controlled environment, he was abruptly set free. No supervision, no guidance, no mandatory counseling, no support to help him transition back into society. For the defense, this lack of oversight was a critical failure, one that placed both Montwheeler and the public at risk. The courtroom debate grew increasingly polarized. Both sides raised compelling points about Montwheeler's actions, his mental state, and the systemic flaws that allowed this tragedy to occur. In court, the prosecution emphasized Montwheeler's calculated actions leading up to the crime, and they argued that inviting Anita Harmon to meet under false pretenses shows clear premeditation. Was not the impulsivity of someone in a mental health crisis, they say. The high-speed chase that followed, ending in the tragic death of David Bates, further demonstrated Montwheeler's recklessness and disregard for human life. To the prosecution, these were the actions of a manipulative and dangerous man who was fully aware of his choices. The defense countered and pointed to systemic failures. They argued that Montwheeler's 20 years in the Oregon State Hospital could have and may have worsened underlying mental health issues, leaving him untreated and unstable upon release. Additionally, his abrupt discharge with no supervision, no reintegration plan, was, they claimed, a critical failing of the system. While the defense acknowledged Montwheeler's admission of deception, they maintained that the lack of support played a significant role in this tragedy. The trial revealed starkly opposing views. One side painted Montwheeler as a calculating predator, while the other questioned whether his actions were partly the result of systemic neglect. Okay, and now that you have heard the story of Anthony Montwheeler, the details of his crimes, the arguments on both sides, the ultimate question falls to you. Who bears the responsibility for what happened here? And overall, what happened here? Was Montwheeler simply a master manipulator who exploited the system at every turn? From his insanity plea to his shocking confession 2 decades later? Why 2 decades? Did he know exactly what he was doing, both in gaining his release and in committing the horrific acts that followed? And if so, should the focus remain solely on his personal accountability? Or was this a case where the system itself shares some of the blame? Montwheeler was released with no oversight, no reintegration plan, no monitoring, despite a violent past and a confession that should have raised flags. Should this tragedy be seen as a failure of the laws and procedures meant to protect society from exactly this type of danger? Think about the victims and their families, the lives lost, and the futures changed forever. Think, too, about the balance between individual rights and public safety. Where should we draw the line? These are the questions that linger long after the court's decision has been made. Was justice served in this case? Or does the Montwheeler tragedy highlight deeper issues that remain unsolved? Montwheeler's case forces us to confront some of the toughest questions about justice and mental health and the systems that are designed to protect us. Was this a tragedy that could have been prevented if someone somewhere had sounded the alarm? Or is this the inevitable result of a legal and psychiatric framework that struggles to balance compassion with accountability? As you think about this case, consider the broader implications. Should laws around the insanity defense and psychiatric release be stricter, with mandatory supervision for those re-entering society? Or does tightening these systems risk punishing individuals who genuinely need help? And what about the families of Anita and David? They're left grappling with unimaginable loss, while the rest of us try to make sense of how this even happened. Where does justice lie for them? At the end of the day, Montwheeler's story leaves us with more questions than answers. But maybe that's the point. It's not about finding the perfect solution. It's about recognizing the flaws in the systems we rely on and working towards something better. So what do you think? Was Montwheeler mad, bad, or something else entirely? And who do we hold accountable when the systems meant to protect us fail so catastrophically? Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. As always, stay safe out there, stay curious, and ask the difficult questions. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.